If you're watching this video on February 1st, happy Freedom Day. What's Freedom Day? Well, it's one of the most important days in American history and a day that is special in the Black community. Freedom Day should be a national holiday, just like the 4th of July or Juneteenth, the day that slaves finally received word of the Emancipation Proclamation, letting them know that they were free. Haven't heard about Juneteenth either? I'm not surprised. Like most Black history, both Freedom Day and Juneteenth have for the most part been left out of U.S. history books. But for now, that's another video for another day. Back to Freedom Day. February 1st, 1865 was the day that President Abraham Lincoln signed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution into law, freeing all slaves. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. With these words and a joint resolution of Congress, President Lincoln ushered in freedom for millions of enslaved people, although the number of states that were needed to ratify the amendment wasn't reached until December 6, 1865. Unfortunately, Lincoln didn't live to see the amendment ratified, even though the end of slavery sparked celebrations nationwide. But hold on a second. That's getting ahead of the story. That was 1865. Let's go back a few years to 1862 and the actual time and place where freedom really began for slaves, on Hilton Head Island, South Carolina, in a historic town called Mitchellville, as well as an important part of the Underground Railroad. So, to set the stage, the Union Army discovered that Hilton Head Island was a great central and strategic location between Charleston, Beaufort, and Savannah. Since those cities were military strongholds and crucial resupply areas for the Confederate Army, it was the perfect place for the Union Army's headquarters of the South, as well as a place to launch military campaigns. From Hilton Head, operations in several daring missions were launched, some of which involved historic figures like Harriet Tubman and Robert Smalls. Hilton Head's Civil War story begins in November of 1861, when the Union troops entered the Port Royal Sound and invaded the island. The sound of gunboats caused white Confederate soldiers, plantation owners, and residents to flee. They left behind everything, including 10,000 slaves. When those first shots were fired, the enslaved island population seized their opportunity for freedom. Despite threats and deception by some local plantation owners, freedom seekers bolted into the woods until the Union's troops occupied the area. Under the protection of the Union, Mitchellville became the destination for waves of freedom seekers fleeing bondage in the nearby Confederate territories of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. It was the place where the newly emancipated would first experience freedom and emerge from being enslaved into responsible citizens.
Even though I grew up here, I was born in Savannah. I grew up here on this island. I stayed with my grandmother, my mother's mother, and she was a descendant of Richard White.
Sometimes in life, big things begin with the simplest of words or the slightest gesture. The story of Mitchellville is just that, a radical idea during a time in our nation's history when the Union forces were trying to win the Civil War, as well as figure out how to deal with a large population of newly freed blacks who were dispersed throughout the South.
The town of Mitchellville began in 1862, when General Ormsby Mitchell, a former attorney and professor, assumed command of the X-Corps and the Department of the South. Good colored people, you have a great work to do, and you're in a position of responsibility. This experiment is to give you freedom, position, homes, your families, property, your own soil. It seems to me a better time is coming. A better day is dawning. With these words, Union General Ormsby Mitchell proclaimed that the land of the people of Mitchellville, South Carolina, had once toiled under the chains of slavery, was now their own. When General Mitchell issued the military order freeing the slaves on Hilton Head and nearby Sea Islands, he also provided them with land large enough for a town. Each family was given a plot to grow crops and encouraged to organize their own town, where they were able to buy land, vote, and farm for wages. The fully functioning town created an organizational structure with its own elected officials, taxes and retail stores, and compulsory education for children aged 6 to 15, something that had been denied to them as slaves. Their success is especially impressive because the newly freed represented a fusion of various African languages and cultures that are collectively known as Gullah or Geechee. The people of Mitchellville were hungry to learn, and after having been denied education for so long, being free to learn to read and write was something that they highly valued. Both adults and children were hungry to be educated. This incredible thirst for knowledge led to Mitchellville establishing the first compulsory education law in South Carolina. By 1862, the town had more than 1,500 residents, some of which had joined the Union Army. Eventually, the population grew to around 3,000 people. Because of its military importance, access to the town was restricted. Even white people were required to have military passes to enter the town's limits. Mitchellville was so successful that Harriet Tubman was sent to Hilton Head to observe the Port Royal Project as a model of future freedmen projects in the U.S.
The Mitchellville blacks who were living on Hilton Head Island lived in a way that was far from common for the time. Called contrabands, they were able to create a safe place in the midst of a hostile, life-threatening environment. They became free while being surrounded by states that were not ready to give up on slavery, and they managed to develop a relatively comfortable, profitable, and traditional way of life. Of course, as time went on and the Civil War was its backdrop, Mitchellville quickly developed into a bustling town and economic location for the freedmen who established new traditions and made it home. The town became an important part of the war effort because it had its own retail center and a 500-bed hospital. By providing troop support and goods and services, it also financially benefited the residents. As the war continued, injured Union soldiers were brought to Hilton Head, increasing the number and variety of medical issues, including figuring out how to contain a smallpox outbreak amongst the ranks. Clara Barton, a Civil War nurse and relief worker, came to Hilton Head to care for the soldiers with smallpox as well as inspect the hospital boats. Just as her ship pulled up to the dock on April 7, 1863, 9 federal ironclads launched an attack on Fort Sumter and Moultrie as part of the Union's efforts to recapture Charleston. Despite her exciting arrival, Clara spent 9 months on Hilton Head, along with her brother Captain David Barton, who was an Army quartermaster, and her nephew Stephen, who served in the military telegraph office. During her time on the island, she mailed correspondence to a friend named Amy, who she told about her work with the troops and furnishing Fort Mitchell. Clara's work delivering supplies, treating the wounded, and her compassion for the troops is legendary. Clara Barton, however, wasn't the only famous woman to come to Hilton Head. In 1862, Harriet Tubman had been assigned to Beaufort to help teach and nurse the former slaves on the Sea Islands. Eventually, she made her way to Mitchellville and was embedded with the 2nd South Carolina Infantry under Colonel James Montgomery. Both women were granted special permission to travel along with the troops, including the infamous U.S. colored troop, the 54th, out of Massachusetts. As a result of her talent for blending in with slaves and ability to gather detailed reconnaissance information, Harriet went undercover spying on the Confederates. While in the area, her most notable mission was the Combahee River Raid, during which over 700 slaves were rescued. Both women were instrumental to the Union's efforts and were granted special permission to travel along with the troops, including the infamous U.S. Colored Troops 54th out of Massachusetts. When U.S. Colored Troop soldier Private Charles K. Reason of the 54th Massachusetts lay dying after a severe amputation was asked why he joined the war, Reason replied,
"I know what I'm fighting for. Only a few years ago, I ran away from a man in Maryland who said he owned me. And since then, I worked on a farm in Syracuse. But as soon as the government would take me, I came to fight. Not for my country, I never had any, but to gain one."
Roughly 40,000 brave formerly enslaved men, women, and children risked their lives in search of freedom to join the Union. Even after their escape or as a soldier, their safety was not guaranteed. By the end of the war, close to 200,000 black men joined the Union Army nationally. The enormous level of commitment that the slave gave towards fighting to end slavery, as well as risking their lives in support of the war effort, was something that was often questioned. Union Army regiments formed in other states all converged on Hilton Head. Of the 166 Army regiments from the northern states that were stationed here, 13 of which were U.S. Colored Troops. One of those U.S. Colored Troop regiments, the 21st, was formed on Hilton Head and was the first U.S. Army troop to land in Charleston after it fell to the Union Army. Mostly employed on fatigue, guard, and picket duty, the 21st was comprised of a lot of soldiers who decided to stay on the island, making it their home for future generations. Soldier after soldier, their incredible legacies have become the stories of perseverance and pride for generations to come. This is an image of unidentified soldiers from the U.S. Colored Troops 21st Regiment. Among those who fought alongside them was Richard White, who joined the 21st Colored Troops as a private and was one of the very few black soldiers who was promoted to a corporal.
Richard was in the military. He was a corporal. And 22nd Light Artillery U.S. Colored Troops. He got hurt. He messed up he lost a finger from a gunshot. A joint on one hand. And he got hurt, or he caught pneumonia, and he suffered a lot.
Every street on Hilton Head has a history, but as you travel down Beach City Road, you'll find that it's one of the most historically designated roads on the island. From end to end, and marker after marker, the significant history here dates back over 150 years, making the Beach City corridor simply incredible. As you drive down Beach City Road, just past the Matthews Circle, you'll find the oldest church on the island, First African Baptist Church, which began Hilton Head's religious foundation in 1863. Pastored by Reverend Abraham Murchison, an escaped slave preacher, he started the church with 120 members, all contrabands. The first service was attended by General Ormsby Mitchell, who said, "Yesterday was a Sunday. A little church built for the Negroes was consecrated to the worship of Almighty God." Reverend Murchison is remembered for baptizing and marrying thousands of freedmen and helped recruit Union soldiers into the Civil War.
It's where some roots go back to, mainly like Reverend Murchison, who started the First African Baptist Church here, along with the Union soldiers. Believe it or not, my tie is because Richard and Amelia were actually married in First African Baptist Church. Nancy and Ben Green were married in First African Baptist Church. My mother was a member of First African, so am I. So Mitchellville, yes, everything ties back to Mitchellville because of, how should I say, being a slave.
Religion played a very important part in Mitchellville because the church was not only spiritually significant, it was where people received their information. Recognized as a place of safety, the church was used for meetings, events, and discussing issues that were important to the community. The residents founded two churches, the First African Baptist Church in 1862 and Queen Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church in 1865, both of which still operate today.
As the community grew, so did the number of churches. The second church to form was Queen Chapel African Methodist Episcopal, which began when Reverend Richard Harvey Kane, James H.A. Johnson, and James Handy were on their way to Charleston on the steamship Argo on May 12, 1865. During their journey, a storm arose, forcing the ministers to land on Hilton Head in an area called Cherry Hill. As they waited for the storm to pass over, they decided to have services with prayers and singing under a large oak tree, and so began the first service establishing the Queen Chapel AME Church. The church was formerly located on Robbers Row, and it is believed that the church was taken apart and reassembled on Beach City in 1892. Eventually, a few other churches were established around the island: St. James Baptist in 1886, Central Oak Grove Missionary Baptist in 1887, and Mount Calvary Missionary Baptist in 1914. Each church stands as the spiritual core of the island's religious community. As the churches grew, the differences in their worship or denominations did not change the relationship and the interconnectivity between them. The congregations rotated their services between the locations every 3 months. When they were not in church, services would be held in local praise houses 3 times a week. The practice of the congregations coming together to share services, celebrations, and church anniversaries, all of which still continue today.
Representing the vital importance of education to the Gullah, the Cherry Hill School stands as yet another cherished location along the Beach City corridor. Built in 1937 and financially maintained by the Gullah community, the one-room schoolhouse was the first building on Hilton Head that was solely purposed for educating 30 elementary students at a time between the 1st and 5th grades. Previously, children were taught across the street in an area within the St. James Church. Currently owned by the historic St. James Baptist Church, the building serves as an annex for meetings, church functions, and a soup kitchen.
Built as a semi-permanent fort and designed to hold up to 27 guns, Fort Howe was constructed in 1864, in part by the 32nd USTC Infantry, a volunteer unit of 500 officers and men, which was comprised mostly of free blacks from Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, rather than formerly enslaved men. Built to defend Mitchellville from possible Confederate raids, ultimately, Fort Howe did not receive any action. As one of 3 major earthwork forts on the island, its preeminence and longevity represent impressive skills in military engineering of the time for a defensible fort.
Even though the freedmen came from different areas and cultures, life in Mitchellville was based on a lot of similarities. Some families spent the morning on the water and the afternoon in the field. Island life included chores on the farm based on the season, and plowing and planting the fields was usually the day's work. Sometimes a family was fortunate enough to have a marsh tacky horse. The workhorse was perfect for the low country terrain and temperature and helped with heavy lifting or providing transportation to church on Sundays when the pastor was on the island for service. The freedmen who decided to begin their new life in Mitchellville became the foundation for the Gullah families that continue to live on the island today. 20 surnames represent the original first families. Of the families, the traditions and similarities between their lifestyles was based on the blending of African cultures. Most families with adult males joined the Union Army, while other family members farmed their land or fished off of the local waters. Most people don't live in the same place all of their life, or can say that they've lived there for more than 102 years. Mother Ethel Rivers can. As one of the island's true treasures, she has the love and respect of all who know her. Recognized as the oldest living Gullah on Hilton Head, she has the distinction of being a resident of historic Mitchellville and the keeper of the Native Islanders' history.
I'm 100 and what going on 2. I born 1918, so you can figure it out for yourself. I've been living here all my days. Mama teach me everything she had know of what to do. That's right. She died and I still miss her. Yep, and I ain't never had no sister. I had 3 brothers, but I never had no sister. And my mama had 16 head of children. And I come up behind and I run them over. I had 17. That's right. And I feel good.
Hilton Head's history is such a unique one. The combination of Mitchellville's story and its continued impact that it's had on the Gullah community, the outcome of the Civil War, race relations, and even the impacts of compulsory education are still unfolding today. But little is known about the individuals and families who, after being thrust into servitude in a new land, chose not only to embrace their new surroundings, but loved, nourished, and cultivated the island as their home. The series of stories, The First Families of Hilton Head Island, brings attention to the families that made Hilton Head what it is today, a breathtakingly beautiful space that invites relaxation and civility. Because the Gullah community lived on an island that for years did not have a bridge to the mainland, the Gullah were essentially separated from the rest of the Low Country, working with what they had, creating lives for themselves that were made up of hard work as farmers and fishermen, yet full of love and support for each other as a community. The old saying that it takes a village was obvious here. Hilton Head was a village where neighbors helped neighbors, where responsibility for each other's welfare was just how it was done.
Believe it or not, we didn't have a lot as far as what people says that we were poor. But I never knew poverty because we could go in the river and get all the fish, shrimp, crabs, and whatever you wanted, and nobody bothered you because you were only going out there to get what you could eat. What we didn't, we used to go hunting in the woods, for the deer, whatever else, and now you can't even mess with go hunting or anything like that. My grandmother was a farmer. We grew corn, okra, tomatoes, beans, peas, potatoes, sweet potatoes.
The importance of knowing one's culture, uniting with family, and connecting with our ancestors is not something that's new. After slavery, searching for separated or lost family was what people had to do. Today, with a little curiosity and some research, we can easily find out who we really are. Research into some of the families revealed Civil War service in the U.S. colored troops for most Gullah families, including the Browns, Jones, and Burkes. In addition to their participation in the military, several Hilton Head Hospital patient records and military dispositions further connected the families to Mitchellville.
I try my best to trace so many things back to learn more about Richard and Amelia and the things, so many of the things that they went through. But one thing I can tell you that I found out, all the people back then, neighbors or family members, those people was very close because they couldn't read or write. And when they were doing the affidavit, they had different people, friends and stuff, to come and actually vouch for them. They had to do that for Amelia to get Richard's pension, to say that she was not married and she didn't have any children, and she was a widower. I mean, so many people that were there. When I started reading these names and stuff like that, now I look at people here on the island, and a lot of them that I read about, the names and stuff, I know the families.
Each incredible story is a fascinating cultural legacy rooted by a demonstration of courage, endurance, service, and a strong sense of community. Just like the language, Gullah traditions are based on a blend of various African cultures. The Gullah community structure is as a village, where everything was shared and where it was believed that one would give of oneself, regardless of what it was, from food to skills. Every family story, although different, share traditional and cultural commonalities, as well as highlight their similarities in strength and determination.
The thing I liked about it is, so what I didn't grow, you grew, we'd share. We shared, they always shared. If I went in the river and I caught a bunch of fish, my grandmother would always tell me, you take some over to Virginia, you take some to Bertha, you take some over here, you take some over here, and don't forget to take some to Alice. We shared. What I had, you had.
One's pride can be rooted in several areas. However, sometimes it takes just one thing in someone's life to motivate and sustain their pride. As newly freedmen, the Gullah had a lot to be proud of. With a new life and freedom also brought the opportunity to be counted as an American. The story of the Aiken family is one of those stories that demonstrate the desire to make sure that they were documented and counted in every way possible, from census counts to voter registrations to military service and more. The Aikens left behind a clear paperwork trail to show not only how fully they were participating in the new American dream, but also demonstrating their pride in doing so. Joseph Aiken was a slave who, when he enlisted in the USTC 29th Regiment, Company G 2nd Light Artillery, his papers included a $10 bounty, which the Army paid. During his service, he was responsible for post and garrison duty on the island and in Beaufort. Military documents show that he was arrested, but not confined. Within a short time of his enlisting, he was promoted to a corporal and paid $4.48 a month. Joseph's son Peter also believed in fighting for his freedom and joined the USTC 34th Regiment Company D and was listed as the company's bugler. Usually under 18 years old, a company's bugler was responsible for telling the time, duties in the camp, and also guiding the actions of troops in battle. Listed among Mitchellville's residents, by 1868, within 3 years of emancipation, Joseph and his son Peter registered to vote in the Bluffton-Hilton Head electoral district. It is interesting to note that in the 1870 census, Peter Aiken reported himself as being able to read. This is significant because before emancipation, attaining literacy was usually a clandestine activity. Because being literate and a slave was against the law in some states, and it's been estimated that by 1865, only 9% of slaves displayed some degree of literacy. And yet the Aikens knew then that knowledge was power. They also knew that, to a large degree, their lives and the lives of future generations depended on education. Joseph and his siblings built their lives around living off the land and the sea, as most islanders did. However, according to the census records, by 1870, the Aikens were successful enough to list their wives as housewives rather than as farm workers, which meant the family was self-sufficient enough to be sole providers for their family and didn't need additional farm help from the female members of the family. By the 1900 census, all the family members over 10 years old were listed as able to read, and most of them could write. Roughly 50 years later, the family proudly celebrated its first college graduate from Savannah State, great-great-great-granddaughter Julia Grant Thomas, who became an educator, paving the way for countless other Aiken family graduates to come.
My grandmother and everybody in the family talk about Amelia White. Well, I was nosy. I wanted to see, well, okay, who was Amelia White? Was she married? Yeah, okay. Well, who was she married to? Who was her husband? And that's what drew me to start digging and to finding out about him. I found out so much information about him from the military records that I was able to acquire through the Heritage Library.
It's not very often when you can pull back the curtain of time and get a clear picture of how life was in the past. Some of the Gullah families left incredibly documented breadcrumbs of exactly how their life was and their experiences. The Brown story has a wealth of information found in a very detailed Civil War disposition from 1898 that was told by Mary Bayard Brown in an effort to receive her husband Prince Brown's Civil War pension. Described by her as a small man with a ginger complexion and with one shoulder lower than the other that made him look one-sided, she said that Prince also suffered from extensive back pain, which probably came from the loads that he carried on his back during the war and the long marches. Prince served in the U.S. Colored Troops from 1862 when he was 37 years old as a private in Company E of the 21st Regiment. He participated on operations against Charleston as well as on duty in several of the Sea Islands. Stricken with smallpox in 1866, she said that he was too poor to see a doctor and eventually got too weak and helpless until his death. Mary goes on to say that she was born a slave and sold along with her family at the age of 13. Eventually, a white preacher who used to travel about and preach wouldn't marry Prince and Mary until they were baptized. So he baptized them and then married them in front of Squire Pope's residence, where she said we colored people had to meet to be baptized. Mary's words not only spoke about her life on the island with Prince, growing 1 year's cotton crop for $30, but also about the year that her house, fencing, and crops were blown away for a growing season by the 1893 Sea Island hurricane. For the Browns, establishing the family and working hard is evident in the property that they were able to acquire. When they made enough money to purchase land, they, along with several other Gullah families, including the Murrays, the Fergusons, the Robinsons, and the Fords, were able to buy 800 acres from the government in the Marshland and Chaplin areas for $253.75. Other listed possessions were 79 acres and a building valued at $230, 3 horses valued at $140, 1 buggy valued at $8, 1 cart valued at $8, and household furniture valued at $14.
He was, I looked, he's a short man, but the things that he went through, and I told one of my kids that even though he might have been a short man, he demanded a lot of respect from his fellow men.
He was 5'4", right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
5'4".
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he was pretty young as well, I think.
Yep. When he went in, he was only 23.
Yes.
Yeah. He was 23 years old. And he was only there, he got up when he was, almost 25. Mm-hmm. So he didn't stay in long, but, He made a difference. He made a big difference.
Yeah.
The Burkes played a part in all of the island's activities. Edward Burke was one of the former slaves who chose to stay in Hilton Head and make it his home. Born in 1825, he became the patriarch of 9 generations of Burkes, who formed the island that he eventually left to his son, January. Edward was around 40 years old during the Civil War, and January Burke was about 12 in 1863. There are no records of either of them serving in the war. However, because of their ages, they probably contributed to the war effort in some way. Mitchellville hospital records show that patients came to the hospital for the usual variety of ailments. It is from those records that we learned that 2 small children were admitted to the hospital on June 11, 1867, for 16 days to be treated for recurring fever. The children were named Rachel Burke, age 9, and Edward Burke, age 3. According to the records, the Burke family lived in the Chapelton area of Hilton Head Island. Their parents, Edward and Mary, had 2 other children, January and Polly. January's son, Harry, and his wife, Rebecca, worked for the soldiers in Palmetto Dunes. This couple was responsible for laundering and ironing the soldiers' uniforms. The work that they did afforded them the chance to bring food to the area of Shelter Cove, where they lived at the end of each day. A generation later, January's son James and his brother-in-law Henry Ford became bakers in Savannah at Houston's and Clausen's bakeries. Eventually, Henry became known as the island's the bread man, because he would bring his van full of breads and cakes home every day to sell to the native islanders. His daily deliveries were truly an island's favorite, and on some days, he would run out of bread before making it all the way around the island. Over time, the Burke family was able to make a good life for themselves on the island. Back then, people lived like they were rich, and everyone knew each other, and they shared all that they had. The sense of community was so strong among the island families that they would come together to build each other's houses.
Why is the cemetery named after her? Do you know?
Because the cemetery was actually part of the 60 acres. And from my understanding, they started that cemetery when Richard died, for him to be buried there.
Very few details are known about the personal stories and often heroic lives of the original residents of Mitchellville. The story of the lawyer family is important because it's a story of survival and fearless determination to succeed against all odds. This is a story of a proud and courageous American family that dates all the way back to Mitchellville's heyday. Their story begins with Edward Lawyer Sr., otherwise known as Ned, who was born into slavery in 1841 on Edisto Island. Around 1863, when he was in his early 20s, it was believed that he escaped from his owners and eventually made his way to Hilton Head. Ned was among the 10,000 slaves who risked their lives escaping from areas all over the South to get to where they would be protected and permitted to begin their lives as free men and women, as well as join the military. Like many of the escaped slaves, at 25 years old, he wanted to do his part to end slavery and enlisted in the U.S. Colored Troops 21st Infantry on May 11th of 1863 and served until 1866. After the war, he settled on Hilton Head and married Rena Richardson, and together they had 6 children. This was the beginning of a family legacy rich in love for the island and its unique water-based culture. The lawyers, like most families on Hilton Head, depended on the land as well as the surrounding waters to sustain them, but for generations, they chose to make fishing their family business. This included Ned's sons, Edward Jr. and Jack Lawyer, and all of his grandsons after him, including Arthur Lawyer Sr. However, even though an existence surrounded by water brought them life and joy, it also brought tragedy as well. Everyone in the family had a part to play in the family business. The men were responsible for going out on the water to catch the fish, and the women processed them. Every day, the men went out in a bateau to farm the waters of Broad Creek. This included the skillfully woven nets that they cast into the waters to catch the fish. Edward Jr.'s daughter, Helen, was an expert in the fine art of net making, providing the nets they used to catch shrimp and other types of fish. Over the years, Ned's grandson, Arthur Jr., began to focus on oysters. This meant that every day the lawyer men would take their boats out, wade through shallow water into the thick mud they called gumbo mud, and fill their buckets with oysters. Once the oysters were collected, they were brought back to shore, and some made it to the table for dinner, but most were sold to the local oyster factories for about $12 a bushel. Once at the oyster factory, Arthur Sr.'s wife, Mary Jones Lawyer, along with most of the women from the island, took over the job of washing and shucking the oysters for about $7 a gallon. The hard work of filling 6 to 7 gallons a day was considered a good day's work. That was the daily routine for the men and women in the Lawyer family for generations. The problem was that even though they lived on an island surrounded by water, Many of the native islanders didn't know how to swim, and tragically, Arthur Lawyer Sr. drowned while trying to provide for his family. A lot has changed on the island since then, and the Lawyer family continues to be a part of the island's future. Although they do not depend on farming and fishing for their livelihood as they did in years past, they do continue the tradition of boating and fishing today.
But it's nice to know that Amelia and the things that she went through to acquire and actually to provide for her family. Amelia died in 1926, the year my mother died, the year my mother was born. And I used to ask my mom, what did grandmother tell you about old lady Amelia? She said, she used to laugh and says, the only thing mama ever said about her grandmother, that the old lady's feet were so bad she couldn't even wear shoes, you know. So I said, wow. But apparently, she was a very strong and demanding woman, which when she spoke, everybody listened. I know that my grandmother was like that. When I came along, Victoria, they call her Tori or Maggie. Everybody in the family looked to her, and what she says, that was it. She was the matriarch of the family. She was the matriarch of the family. And you know, you think, I used to see my grandmother, she carried a stick when she was walking. I said, boy, she's a little bitty lady with a big stick.
It is not very often that we're able to take a peek back into time and in return get a clear vision of how life was in the past. It is only when we get those rare opportunities to pull back the curtain of someone's past that we have the chance to learn something new, to experience more, and to expand our perspectives in ways that enable us to change our thinking about others as well as ourselves. That's what happened after years of Black history research, that a simple document from the Jones family provided a richer and clearer understanding of the Black experience during the Civil War years. Then, Blacks were forced to fight on so many levels. They had to fight to prove that they were men, not animals. They had to fight to earn their freedom. And even when they fought alongside the Union Army to unify the nation, they had to fight to prove that they deserved to receive their pensions for serving in the war. After the war, having an army pension was almost a life and death matter for newly freed slaves. Many soldiers were not paid for their service or had to obtain witness to help them verify who they were, as well as prove that they were in fact veterans of the Civil War. Most USCT soldiers had to fight for their pensions, which were often denied. Matthew Jones, one of the early residents of Mitchellville, was one of those soldiers. An escaped slave at 18 years old, his enlistment papers document that he had a bounty on his head for $100 when he joined the USCT 21st Regiment in 1864, receiving a monthly salary of $1.37 for his service. Regardless of his documentation, on November 6, 1901, Matthew Jones was required to give an oral disposition in an effort to receive his military pension. This is an excerpt of what he shared. Born as property to slave owner George Stoney, at the time of his writings, he did not know the year or day of his birth on Edisto Island. He did, however, know his parents. His father was Solomon Jones, owned by William Pope, and his mother was Hannah Jones. As slaves, their given name was Pope. However, he did not know why or when his parents decided to change their surname to Jones. As a slave of about 18 years old, Matthew risked his life to leave his enslavement and join the ranks of the Union Army. Usually when the story has been told of slaves joining the Civil War, it is told as if they were simply welcomed into the ranks. Rarely do we get a first-hand account of the humiliation they experienced. Matthew tells us of a different experience. Upon his arrival to enlist, he says, "I was stripped, measured and examined by a medical doctor, then placed into the 21st Regiment of the Union Colored Troops to serve in the War of 1864 to 1866 under General Littlefield." As a soldier, he says that he was never in battle. However, he did need treatment for frostbite on his great right toe. Originally from Pinckney Island, he moved to Hilton Head and was a resident of Mitchellville, where Matthew went on to marry Tina Middleton, Through a lot of hard work, the couple was able to earn enough money to buy 27 acres of Stony Squire Pope land for $225. 8 generations later, his descendants still live on the island that Matthew and Tina purchased. The family's deep roots on the island have made lasting impacts to the island and its Gullah culture. As one of the founding deacons of the Mount Calvary Missionary Baptist Church, Matthew was an integral part in the formulation of the church over 102 years ago. The Jones family connection to Mount Calvary lives on today.
The stories from yesterday continue to live on today. So much of Hilton Head's history is directly connected to the people who made the island their home 7 or 8 generations ago. Around the island, street by street and neighborhood by neighborhood, bear the names of Gullah ancestors who fought to survive and eventually found freedom. The incredible story of freedom might have begun from the blood, sweat, and tears of our ancestors, but the memories of their struggles have become the strength of what our generation and all of the generations to follow will be remembered for their sheer determination.
You take now the Champions. He was in the Civil War also.
How does that feel for you? I mean, you've got the Champions, you've got the whites, you've got the greens.
All that was in the Civil War.
And Matthew Jones, who was Richard's cousin, he was in the Civil War as well. How does that feel for you? It makes me feel great in that sense, because now I can say, well, we are really a part of this country. Why? Because so many of them fought in the Civil War and World War I. My father served in World War II along with my uncles. Another uncle was in Korea War. I was in Vietnam. I didn't go to Vietnam. I was just in the military then. But yeah. But you come from a long line of military men.
Yes. Like you said, starting at the Civil War, we had 3 of them. I can say I have 3 family members that was actually fought in the Civil War. 2 here on Hilton Head, and 1 either up in South Carolina, or I think what I found, he went to New York. But how I know about him, because his wife Mary applied for his pension. And I have a copy of the paperwork that was submitted where she had actually applied. And that's my next goal, is to now try to find out, see if I can find any military records on William Champion.
There are so many incredible stories of perseverance and survival that continue to live on these grounds. Today, Historic Mitchelville Freedom Park is not just a park. This land was the beginning of freedom, where proud generational legacies, family celebrations, self-sufficiency, independence, and even personal victories were created.
And I'm very proud of it. And a lot of people moved away and forgot about the place. But I was blessed by the Lord to bring me back here. And I brought my children, which 2 of them moved back to California, but my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, I can tell them about it. I look things up in this paperwork, and sometimes my grandson will say, "Grandpa, what you working on?" "I'm reading about Richard White." "Who's that?" And I can tell them and show them. Now, when somebody mentioned Richard White, they know exactly who it is.
Over time, life on Hilton Head is different, yet a lot of things remain the same. The Gullah culture and its traditions continue, and reverence for the past, as well as the desire to remember, will never change. Freedom means that we can all live the life that we are entitled to. A good life that takes us into the future and that's full of cherished family memories.
you see, like then and now is a different. Because everybody got fancy automobile. They got nice fitting clothes. But then you got on your Kingham dress and you dress. Mm-hmm. Now the people go to the store and buy one single suit of maybe it might cost $200-$300. Am I right or wrong?
You're right.
Yeah. There's some people, when I was coming up, the lady that could sew and had was one of them machine where you pump with your feet. She would make a dress for me, an outfit for me. Mm-hmm. So I didn't have to go to Savannah to buy a dress or a suit. I could be and I dress up when I got on my nice gingham dress and my whatever. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's the difference between then and now. Everything is for fancy.
Mm. Today, Freedom Day might not have the respect as a federal holiday as it should, but it's learning opportunities like this one that help us grow in our knowledge and establish traditions, new and old, so that together, as informed Americans, we can pass on the celebration of Freedom Day for us, as well as the freedom of those who came before us. Thank you so much for watching. And again, Happy Freedom Day.